Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the Sydney Conservatorium tonight. It's so great to see a really healthy crowd here, and also welcome to everyone at home on Zoom. You're most welcome here. My name's Neil Perez da Costa. I'm Associate Dean of Research at the Conservatorium, and I welcome you on behalf of our Dean, Anna Reed. She's also the head of school. She's unable to be here tonight because she's accompanying our symphony orchestra on a tour in Europe. So that's the first tour that they've been able to do since our many lockdowns. Tonight, we're going to have the second of our Hook lecture series, and it's going to be given by the esteemed American violinist, Dr. Nicole Cherry, and Chris Cody will come in and introduce her properly in a second. But before that, I'd like to acknowledge the amazing land that we're on here tonight, and the custodians of the land that most of the University of Sydney's central campus is on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge also other First Nations peoples on whose ancestral lands the University of Sydney's other campuses sit and its education and research facilities are situated on. And I pay tribute to the elders, past, present, and to come of our First Nations people. We've had the most wonderful 1.5 days of a symposium called Reimagining Musical Programming, which comes out of a Discovery Project grant called Hearing the Music of Early New South Wales. And the conveners and Chris Cody are all related to this particular grant. They're all working in the same area. And I think at the end of the day today, we're also pleased with the extraordinary presentations we've had. We started with the most wonderful welcome just up here at the top of the Conservatorium, looking over Sydney Harbour. We got to hear an amazing Aboriginal fishing song, and this wonderful canoe that's here at the back. We'll put the lid down later, you can have a look. It's a nui, it's an Aboriginal fishing boat, the sort of thing that would have been seen on Sydney Harbour back at the time that the British arrived here, and for many, many thousands of years beforehand. And that's really a symbol, I think, a really wonderful symbol of this symposium. We've combined the symposium with the Hook Lecture. And before I talk about the Alfred Hook Lecture Series, I'd just like to talk a little bit about our research at the Sydney Conservatorium. We're one of the most dynamic research institutions in music in Australia. Our research extends across a wide range of sub-disciplines in music, from Western classical to Indigenous and non-Western musics, jazz, contemporary, popular, and also music improvisation. We support artistic research, music diversity, musicology, and music education. And like what's happening at this symposium, we foster strong collaborations with key multidisciplinary institutions at the University of Sydney and beyond. And here it includes the Sydney Environment Institute, the Brain and Mind Centre, the China Studies Centre, Sydney Nano, and the Charles Perkins Centre. And there are others as well. We also host Paradisec, a world-class digital archive of records from the many cultures of the Pacific region and beyond. Alfred Samuel Hooke was a practicing architect who believed architecture, like music, was an art vital to people's prosperity. He helped found the University of Sydney's Faculty of Architecture in 1918, from which he retired as Dean in 1949. Hooke's other great love was music. He gave lunch hour talks on the history of music, illustrated by the university's collection of gramophone records. He was a member of the university's choral group and, as a keen organist, was associated with installing the university's War Memorial Carillon, which we heard about yesterday from one of our presenters, which he did in 1928. And he also, close to my heart, founded the Department of Music in 1948, which is where I did my undergraduate study. The Alfred Hooke Lecture is made possible through a generous bequest from Doreen Robson, who we're very grateful for. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris Cody, who's going to introduce Nicole Cherry. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. My name is Christopher Cody. I am one of the conveners of the Reimagining Musical Programming Symposium, and I am thrilled to be here tonight to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Dr. Nicole Cherry, at this Alfred Hook public lecture. I begin by also acknowledging that we are meeting on unceded Gadigal land, and by asking everyone to consider the significance of sharing knowledge in this place. The Alfred Hook Lecture is the Conservatorium's flagship public lecture. Its aim is to weave the knowledge that circulates within the walls of the Conservatorium through our wider community. And over the past 2 days in the Reimagining Musical Programming Symposium, we've seen just how many networks of knowledge operate across Australia's musical landscapes, and how both sometimes problematically and sometimes beautifully, they become entangled. As we continue to ponder this entanglement, I acknowledge that this is and always has been Aboriginal land, and pay my respect to Aboriginal elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people here tonight. On the topic of beautiful entanglements, I would now like to tell you a bit about the work of our keynote presenter, Dr. Nicole Cherry. Dr. Cherry is Assistant Professor of Violin and String Area Coordinator at the University of Texas, San Antonio, and second violinist in the award-winning Marian Anderson String Quartet. She holds degrees from the Peabody Institute, the Shepherd School of Music, and the Juilliard School, and has produced award-winning research on the 19th century Afro-European violin virtuoso George Bridgetower. In 2016, Dr. Cherry began her Forge with George commissioning project, in which rediscovered compositions of George Bridgetower, new compositions, companion pieces, and arrangements inspired by her research on Bridgetower are brought together in innovative programs that march toward the 200th anniversary of the Slavery Abolition Act in England, the country Bridgetower called home. As Dr. Cherry has developed this project, she has premiered works across the United States and Canada, while drawing together a wide range of contemporary composers, including Jessie Cox, Yvette Janine Jackson, Philip Wharton, and Grammy-nominated composer DJ Spar. As a soloist and chamber musician, Dr. Cherry has performed in a long list of major cultural hubs, including the Library of Congress, the Kennedy Center, Strathmore Hall, Lincoln Center, Carnegie Hall, the Smithsonian, and the Banff Center. She's undertaken a solo tour of the Middle East and Asia that included a performance before Queen Noor of Jordan, and performances in the townships of Johannesburg during the apartheid era. Dr. Cherry's musical expertise is incredibly broad, and over the course of her career, she has shared the stage with a wide spectrum of elite artists that have included the International Contemporary Ensemble, the San Francisco Contemporary Chamber Players, the American Chamber Players, the Colorado Pacifica, Audubon, Penderecki, and Cleveland Quartets, jazz pianist Stanley Cowell, gospel music icon Richard Smallwood, and the late Whitney Houston. Dr. Cherry is a sought-after public speaker, and her inspiring work on the different kinds of stories musical programs might unfold served as one of the key impetuses for the Reimagining Musical Programming Symposium we are in the midst of, and for which she will now deliver a keynote address. I am absolutely thrilled that Dr. Cherry has been able to travel from the United States to be with us here tonight. Please join me in making her feel very welcome.
I am very inspired. I'm inspired so much by what I've experienced so far here in Sydney, Australia, my first time here, this part of the world. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this wonderful lecture series. I'm so inspired that it reminds me, just before this in our schedule, that is so beautifully put together, there was a little gathering. Everybody had a little snack and network. Yes? Did you have fun? Okay. Did you bring me some? No. Okay. But traditionally, I grew up in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, probably one of the oldest African-based Christian religions in the United States, in the world now, actually. And what happens usually after some kind of social activity is music, followed by a closing remark by the pastor. I am no pastor, but it seems so apropos that we share a song before I get started, right? So I'm making you sing. One of the most popular songs of I'll move that out of the way here. That's right, I have help. One of the most popular songs that come from the African Methodist Episcopal Church is wow, we got the mood lighting going. This is a little early, actually, but that's okay. You have to roll with it when you're doing reimagining musical programming. Okay. So one of the most popular songs is one I think you'll recognize as well. And it turned out to be a civil rights song as well that the Freedom Singers sang to keep them moving on to change the world. So you might recognize, if I say to you, "This little light of mine," you say, yes, this little light of mine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, cough with me, I'm gonna let it shine. Yeah. Okay, good. So the thing about it is, at this point, we'd be standing up. All right, everybody up. 1, 2. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. I go, yeah, right? I'm gonna let it shine. I'm gonna let it shine. Go. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine. You endured my horrible piano playing and everything. Give yourselves a round. You clapping for yourselves. That's very nice. Now for the boring parts. Okay. Thank you for that. Every week, hearing the various vocal ranges in the church, rhythmic unity, polymetric phrasing, swaying, the clapping, the call, and the response, I understood the importance of community through music and what music can do for a community. So good evening, everyone. I had to sing because, I was short on 1 cup of coffee, by the way. Yes, I'm still at 2 a.m., everybody. To Professor Neil Paris da Costa, Dr. Amanda Harris, Dr. Toby Martin, Dr. Christopher Cody, administration, faculty, and staff of the Sydney Conservatorium, and not least, Lisa Lim, who opened her door to her Composing Women project during the quarantine in 2020. And there I was able to virtually meet many of you already. I'm glad to meet you all in person. I thank you for having me here to join with you in this wonderful symposium, Reimagining Musical Programming. I just love the action of this title. It's exhilarating to think that we create a positive shift in programming just by coming together this way. I'm excited to be part of this journey with all of you. I promise to tell you some stories about my life, some music making, some programming inspirations and challenges. I'll give you a sneak peek into the things I'm working on these days. And so I thank you for coming on this short journey with me tonight. My first memories of music in my life are in my home. My mom, who is here with me, and dad were avid fans of all music. After dinner, I would often find myself here, sitting under the piano, as my dad played anything from Thelonious Monk and Miles Davis to Robert Schumann and Franz Schubert and some of his own improvisations. My older brother would take me to improvisation sessions, and when I could barely play in first position, and as older brothers do, he still made me play. Thank you, Dad. Thank you, my brother. But I'm grateful for it. I think since then, I've been investigating the possibilities of repertoire and what you can do with it. Each piece has its own genesis and connection to people, to culture, to history. I try to find these connections through community engagement, teaching, outreach, and programming. This is what manifested my commissioning project, Forge with George. For me, reimagining musical programming is so much of who I am as a musician and a person. I believe embracing community and music making intersect. There is no separation between the two. As we all know, great music making is about interactions, just like we had a moment together. We know each other better now, yes? The interactions of sound, time, space, the people, the breath, and any elements producing those things. This, in so many ways, is a microcosm of life's experience. How we interact can determine who we become. Throughout my life, I have allowed my interactions to guide me, and I've become intentional about how they strengthen my programming. I am reminded of an interaction that I discovered about my commissioning project namesake 19th-century Afro-British violinist, George Bridgetower. George's father, John Frederick Augustus, in 1790, walked, carriaged, boated young George at the age of 11 from Paris to Windsor Palace to share with King George III the brilliance of his son. It was Charlotte Popendiac, the lady-in-waiting to Queen Charlotte, who answered and to whom she called in her memoir, that annoying black Bridgetower. She let them in anyway. Many visits later and many performances for royal gatherings later, George Bridgetower found himself under the patronage of the Prince of Wales, soon to be King George IV, for the next decade. If it weren't for this effort of John Frederick and Charlotte Popendiac, we would not know the gifts of George Bridgetower. Learning of George Bridgetower's contribution and this interaction was life-shifting for me, and this is the act of decolonizing your community. As a current practice, I've employed the philosophy of another George, composer George Lewis of Columbia University, who draws upon the model of creolization as a way toward inserting the imagined sound of new music and decolonization. He chose this metaphor because it specifically references race and the multinational. He says, a creolized contemporary music culture would be race-aware, not race-deaf, establishing a mosaic identity that recognizes historical, geographical, and cultural cross-connection to pursue a new complexity that promises far greater creative depth. I believe this combination is a foundation for a breathing, pulsing community, one that continues to thrive. Tonight, I want to point to 3 interactions that have empowered me as a curator and artist, and in what ways they have become an important part of my career design. Investing in new populations, creating mentoring circles, and building community engagements and partnerships. Perhaps one will resonate with you. Interaction 1, investing in new populations. Reimagining musical programming started with me reprogramming who I imagined I was in music. It was a wintry Saturday in Washington, D.C. That might come out because I spent the summer in England, I'm so sorry. Where most schools would close, the Washington, D.C. Youth Orchestra held practice as usual on an icy day, and my parents made a practice of teaching me to honor my schedule. I was 14 years old and a second violinist sitting last chair, unbeknownst to me at that time, sitting with a student orchestra made up of many of today's award-winning international performers, orchestral players, and arts administrators. But on that icy day, most were present, except, yes, the second violin section. The last chair of the second violins, me, was alone in the section. At an early age, we learn what it means to fit, to belong. And in music, often that is determined by where you sit. That can predispose us to self-doubt. Of course, that will be the day that the orchestra director, Lynn McLean, would double-check our preparedness in the string section by having us play one by one in quartets. So first violin, 1 second violin, me, 1 viola, and 1 cellist. Fortunately, I'd taken some time to look at the first movement of Mozart's 11th Symphony in D major. I'd even asked my parents to buy me the LP, and I listened, played it regularly after it was assigned the nerd that I am. And, around and round it went. I played with chairs 12, I played with chairs 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, all the way to 1. My fellow string players turned to me and clapped. Lynn McLean stepped off his podium and shook my hand, and on that day I realized I wasn't last chair. I was part of this group that was needed to make it whole and make my part made a difference. The next rehearsal, Mr. McLean put me in principal second violin chair, which reinforced the feelings of possibility for me. 8 years in the DC Youth Orchestra, I learned investing in new populations could mean moving beyond kinship-like projects, which encourage and reinforce institutionalized socialization, encouraging innovative concert programming, and making serving and getting to know your community a norm. Lynn McLean in 1969 built a youth orchestra program not only for the lower income, not only for the ghetto, not only for the at-risk, but for what he believed was his community. Through his dedication, he created a connection through education and music for his neighbors. We toured the world, performed before dignitaries, premiered symphonies, met some of the greatest artists of all time who performed solos with us in some of the greatest venues in Washington, D.C. We would perform for the White House on Friday and then have regular rehearsal on Saturday, oblivious to the impact we were having on our own lives and others, and to think the highlight of our day was eating Doritos and soda at break. The Washington, D.C. Youth Orchestra gave me a place to feel represented, to be part of a nurturing community and learn how to build my own. It was also the first time I met and worked with a living composer, Talib Rasul Hakim. And though playing Mozart was wonderful, the idea of the music literally evolving, transforming, transfiguring, transmogrifying, just because he was there and we were there, and the music could literally mutate right in front of us in so many ways was unbelievable. He was also just a great guy. And he would talk with each of us and encourage us. This is a picture, by the way, of many of the great Black composers of the time. You might recognize, of course, Daniel Leon, Julius Eastman, Dorothy Redmore, Hale Smith, Oliver Lake, and Carmen Moore. The second interaction taught me to create mentoring circles. My mom used to always ask me, what is your soul's desire? I have to say that because she's here, right? I always took that to mean, look deeply within yourself and decide what it is your true purpose is. But to do that, we must look within ourselves, and amongst ourselves, we must observe the desires of others as well. Mentoring is often focused on the next generation, which is vital. But mentoring is not only an investment in the next generation, it is also continued investment in ourselves, our soul's desire. At 16, I gained some courage, mostly out of my own curiosity, and I took it upon myself to get acquainted with as many artists as I could. Of course, these were the days of 411. I don't know anyone, if anyone remembers that, those days where you could pick up the phone, 411, yes, may I speak to the President of the United States, please? You know, and I seriously did that as much as I possibly could. To the point where I think there was one point where I called the Seinfeld show, believe it or not, to talk to the guy who went bang, 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 bang. Jonathan Wolfe, and he actually answered the phone. And we had a conversation about the fact that he's not a composer, but you might want to talk to, he said, John Maxwell Anderson, who was the producer of many of those shows that we knew of the late 80s and 70s and 80s, but he was an actual composer, lived in Nebraska, and he wrote many, many works, and we were in touch just after that. But if you know the show Silver Spoons or Married with Children, he was busy doing that, but composing in the summers. Well, many of those composers were just life-changing. Gunther Schuller let me sit in on a dress rehearsal just because I showed up early and asked. I was a kid. George Walker, right, let me interview him over the phone after looking up his number. Jeffrey Mumford encouraged me to play and teach new music. Tanya Leone had no problem letting me arrange her woodwind piece for strings. Victoria Bond told me sometimes you have to be the teacher and also be your own teacher. David Diamond was walking randomly down the hallways of Juilliard, saw David Diamond, and I just tapped him on the shoulder and I asked him what was the key to playing contemporary music. And I'll never forget it. He responded, play the new like it's old and the old like it's new. Took that with me, wherever I go. One standout was the great composer Noel da Costa. It was one of my cold calls. Dr. Da Costa had invited me over for lunch to meet me and talk music. He mentioned his model for composition was Harlem Renaissance poet Countee Cullen. From this, I learned to stay open to what might inspire me. He gave me scores, passed me phone numbers, and well, I was a college student, so he fed me food, and that was the most important part of it for me. As a violinist himself, he helped me understand the legacy of the Black American fiddler. He would read me texts about fiddlers from various sources. One important source he led me to was Eileen Southern's book, The Music of Black Americans. In her text, she discusses the relevance of the 18th and 19th century Black fiddler over 36 times. One stick-out story portrayed in that, for me, goes as such. A boy would stand behind the fiddler with a pair of knitting needles in his hands. From this position, the youngster would reach around the fiddler's left shoulder and beat on the strings in the manner of a snare drum. The fiddler sang and stomped his feet as he played. An expert fiddler could stomp the left heel and the right forefoot and alternate this with the right heel and the left forefoot, making 4 beats in a bar. It was this concept that stuck with me, the idea of some sort of performance code switching in fiddling that has an effect on the performer, the performance, and the observers of that performance. My intrigue grew more when I read in volume 1 of Thayer's The Life of Beethoven that Nicole Cherry, in his review of George Bridgetower's performance, characterized his playing as crazy after his premiere with Beethoven in 1803. What might that mean? Da Costa's reimagining of this historical performance is captured in this is the 4th movement of his dance suite, the New Orleans Clog. Various bowings, arpeggiations, some purposeful use of improvisatory pitch outside of the modal scheme, and the aforementioned use of the right heel stomp, right here. From this, I began to realize that my artistic purpose stemmed from several interests that seemed to intersect. For example, my interest in sociology began at a young age. My father was an outstanding social scientist and often brought me to his college classes as young as 7 years old. His insight on teaching, research, music, and relations amongst people became the foundation from which I exist as an artist. There was one vivid occasion that helped me clarify my purpose. I was in school as a master's student, and I took American music history course. The professor was great, we were learning a lot, and gave an assignment to write a term paper on any topic regarding American music. At that time, Black composers was not as popular of a topic, and so I chose to look deeper into that and write my paper on Black composers. I asked him, I said, where can I go to find legitimate sources around Black composers? And he looked at me and said, well, you could go to that place that starts with S. And I was thinking, do you mean the Schomburg Center? That big place which incidentally is one of the world's largest reference facilities, holding over 10 million items devoted to the African diaspora. Do you mean that place? Of course that professor was allowed to forget, but he didn't fully take in the implications of what him forgetting would mean to young me. It was then that I decided to turn my focus to researching works of underrepresented musicians because I realized there is a deep history that had been left untold. From here, it became about integration. This summer is an example of how I, as a teacher and artist, moved through reframing and reimagining repertoire and programming. While teaching in England this past summer, I found myself retracing the steps of two great Afro-European violinist composers. Yes, George Bridgetower, but also Joseph Imedy. As well, I had regular discussions with my students regarding repertoire and the history of the spaces we used. Very similar, wonderful talk today about the historic spaces and the music we play. We performed works by Raymond Chacon, Johannes Brahms, Angelica Negron, Antonin Dvorak, George Philip Telemann, Ignatius Sancho, Chen Yi, and many others. It's this kind of centering and creolization that has more meaning than we realize. A great example is while we memorialize the great composer Ned Rorem, rest in peace, there has been a conscious mentioning that one of Ned Rorem's most inspirational teachers was the Wanamaker Prize-winning African-American composer Margaret Bonds. And reimagining musical programming is community engagement and partnership. It is important to know all your surrounding neighborhoods, boroughs, counties, etc., and know your audiences. Great programs can be built by understanding our surroundings. At the University of Texas, San Antonio, I began a string band recently, in which I explore string music from all over the world, from a historical, cultural, and performative point of view. I introduced Mi Negra by Jesus Florido, and many of the students who are younger, predominantly Hispanic and Latino, though they had heard these sounds before, and these sounds were integrated in their home lives, they could not translate the score upon seeing it. After much conversation with and without instruments, they performed it. Let's show you a little example of that. On their own, without a conductor. They had a lot of fun with that. A creolized music school education can recognize iconographic components of many diasporic languages. Community engagement means getting in the trenches and getting into your community. Impresario Patrick Hayes, the founder of the presenting organization Washington Performing Arts Society in Washington, D.C., with whom I did internships with in 1990 and 91, actively desegregated the theaters and lunch counters in D.C. in the 60s by walking door to door in the underserved neighborhoods of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Now that organizations thrives, led by composer Jenny Bilfield, with performances throughout the Washington, D.C. area that includes performances of Washington, D.C.'s own funk-style go-go music to mezzo-soprano Renee Fleming, artist residencies geared toward local professional musicians, children's programs, as well as its own house gospel choir. Frederick Douglass, in 1855, through his writings and speeches, not only fought for the rights of Blacks, but Native Americans, women, the poor, and Asian immigrant workers. So we have to constantly reevaluate and invent a new incarnative we within our programming that is willing to understand our contemporary and evolving communities. In tonight's show, my reimagining, I will fuse the first, the middle, and the latest works in my project that show the trajectory of these unanswered questions I've had of Bridgetower and those that I've had about the fiddle and how it played a role in the hands of my ancestors. This is what I hope to achieve with my commissioning project, Forge with George. Through it, I build programs that bridge the gap between the ideas of today's composers, synthesizing the contributions of cultures past and present, while also challenging the misconceptions. George Bridgetower is an excellent example of this. He had an extraordinary career, yet in a time when fetishes were trendy, he was labeled a prodigy his entire life. Designated as a mulatto violinist, and was marketed as the African prince. History would have you believe that his only achievement was the association with Beethoven and the premiere of his Ninth Sonata. Amongst his credits are names and venues such as Haydn, Vivaldi, Samuel Wesley, Westminster Abbey, Windsor Castle, the Royal Theatre, Cambridge University, Royal Academy of Music, Philharmonic Society of London, Hanover Square, Stradivarius, which he had two and performed on regularly. While Samuel Wesley was a great fan of Beethoven's performances of Bach, in January 1814, Bridgetower had invited Samuel Wesley and publisher Vincent Novello to his home for a musical gathering. Shortly after the gathering, Wesley wrote Novello, who didn't show, to tell him about the event. An excerpt from this letter of Samuel Wesley states, "Among the tunes played were a trio of Mozart, two of Purcell, one of Sebastian Bach, the chaconne, and the fugue in C from the violin solos." Many historians have reported the first documented performance of the chaconne from Partita No. 2 for violin solo to be performed by Ferdinand David in Leipzig on February 8, 1840. According to Samuel Wesley's letters, however, the first public performance on record of what he called the chaconne was of George Bridgetower in 1814. Dun, da, da, da. I would like to play for you a little excerpt, this is extremely little, of his piece for violin and piano sonata that was written on February 17th of 1797, 4 days before he wrote another letter to Bridgetower inviting him over to play some music. I suspect he had Bridgetower in mind for this wonderful piece. Uh-oh. I don't know where it went because it played a moment ago. We'll come back to that. Let's try it one more time. Nope, okay. It is within the first movement of Beethoven's Sonata 9 in A major during the premiere in 1803 in Ogerton in Vienna. Bridgetower imitated the arpeggiation in the piano part, and this pleased Beethoven so much that he jumped up exclaiming, "Noch einmal, mein lieber Bursch, one more time, my dear fellow." Beethoven clearly enjoyed and adored his performance, and his admiration for him was mystifying. His dedication on the manuscript translates as Mulatto Sonata composed for the mulatto Bridgetower, big wild mulatto composer. The piece you will hear tonight ties in to these discoveries. I'll play the little excerpt of where Bridgetower improvised in the first movement, presto of the Kreutzer Sonata. This is me and Dr. Natalia Sukina. There's the manuscript. I will first play a piece by Yvette Jackson, professor of composition at Harvard University. Yvette transports back to the transatlantic, where there was no safety, there was no place to hide, but where the fiddle represents escapism. 1619 marks the years Africans were brought into slavery in America. 2019, when the piece was written, marked the 400th anniversary of that beginning, which was highly celebrated in the US. I approached Yvette Jackson about composing a piece for me after hearing one of her signature radio operas at the Banff Center. I intended to draw a connection between the American Negro spiritual, the development of the 19th century European classical music, and the cross-cultural contradiction that posed. One comparison I made with Yvette draws a connection and uncanniness, who became more interested through talking to Lisa Lim, actually, between the Negro spiritual, specifically the Negro slave song Go Down Moses, and Niccolò Paganini's Moses Fantasia, based on a theme from Rossini's opera Moses in Egypt. The goal was to correlate the socio-cultural cognitive dissonance they pose when in conversation with each other. Both of these works tell the same biblical story of Moses parting the Red Sea, but from completely different existences. Next will be The Bridgetower, written in 2017 by David Wallace, that tells the story of Afro-British violinist George Bridgetower, through the tongue of Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Rita Dove. This is embellished by the sounds of American music encompassing the nucleus of African-American fiddling combined with poetry, motion, and song. The text bears the question, if only he was not Black, would his life have been different? With its more than 80 poems, Rita Dove's masterful Sonata Mulatica delves into known historical facts about Bridgetower and his contemporaries by imaginatively fleshing them out, while positioning astute social commentary about race, class, society, and the arts. The Bridgetower draws us into the story by overtly asking us to consider its countless ifs and their far-reaching implications. Finally, Jessie Cox's piece, The Violin is for Diggin', written in 2022. In many discussions with Jessie, this piece looks to Africa and the fiddle for answers while speaking to the future in the hands of Black fiddlers. Jessie grapples with the majestic energy that the beginning brings and ponders what the evolution is and could have been through space, time, planetary exuberance, as he mentioned in his talk yesterday. He reframes quotations of blues, jazz, calypso, classical, and various forms of African string music. Inside that, he uses the breath in its many phases. Jessie states exhaling is moaning, shouting, screaming. Inhalation is a courage to continue. This is breathing musically, where breathing becomes rhythm, call response, and phrasing. Breathing musical is entangled in desire for meaning, for togetherness, for being. This program is a dedication to all of our lives and the community that develops from our interactions. Let us hear the messages left to us within our music. This is the violin's bridge between past and future, the fiddler on the palace roof. In May 2020, I completed all my credits for my doctorate. People were calling me doctor. I digitally submitted my document on May 23rd, and remember that on May 24th, George Bridgetower premiered the 9th Sonata, Beethoven's Piano Sonata. Then, my thoughts were shocked into another reality when on May 25th, George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, was murdered by a police officer gasping for air, chanting, "I can't breathe." I documented a response to this sequence of events. I titled it "Fiddler on the Palace Roof." You can lift the lights just a little bit for this part. Amidst the trials to tear down the racist symbolism of the past, The Fiddler on the Roof presents a similar conflict of balance between tradition and progress. The 19th-century London-based black violin virtuoso George Bridgetower had it right when in 1809 he foreshadowed the complexity of arguably one of the world's most utilized melodies. The son of an enslaved runaway and a Polish mother, he was a black man living gainfully in the shadows of the aristocracy. By the request of King George III, Bridgetower wrote a set of variations on God Save the King. The indicted King George's domestic rebellion against the colonists of America would be directed facetiously toward the indigenous and enslaved Africans. It would appear, in addition to the Declaration, America placed its own counter-revolution upon this song by naming it "My Country 'Tis of Thee," sung for the first time on July 4th, 1831. Was this Bridgetower's redemption song? For certain, he had hoped his own child would live a better life than he. She mattered to him and dreamed that her life would matter in the world. Bridgetower, whose perception of life was sacrificed by the colonial gaze he adopted, fortuitously let freedom ring for those who were to come after him. This sweet song of freedom, with its paradoxical meanings, had served to provoke debate about the world's most delicate social cultural issues. Just as the fiddler plays with passion, even at the risk of falling off either side of the roof, if we are truly embracing and actively incorporating freedom into our society, it is then we can find balance, and it will be the injustice that cannot breathe. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. at the beginning. If he hadn't been dark. Brown eyes ablaze in that remarkable face. If he had not been so gifted, so young, a genius with no time to grow up. If he had not grown up undistinguished to an obscure old age, if the piece had truly been, as Kreutzer exclaimed, unplayable, even after our man had played it. And for years, no one else was able to follow, so that the composer's fury was raged for naught. And wagging tongues could keep alive the original dedication from the title page he shredded. Wagging tongues could keep alive. Wagging tongues could keep alive the original dedication from the title page he shredded. Ow! This is interactive, so you can laugh. Oh, if only Ludwig had been better looking, or a real aristocrat. Instead of the unexceptional van from some Dutch farmer, if his ears had not already begun to squeal and whistle, if he hadn't drunk his wine from lead cups, if he could have found true love, then the story would have held. In A.P.O.P. George Bridgetower, son of Friedrich Augustus, the African prince, and Maria Anna Sowiecki of Biala in Poland, traveled from London to Vienna, where he met the great great master who would stop work on his third symphony to write a sonata for his new friend, to premiere triumphantly on May 24th, whereupon the composer himself left up from the piano to embrace his lunatic mulatto. They might have palled around some. Just a couple of wild and crazy guys strutting the town like stars, hitting the bar for a few beers, a few laughs. Instead of a Regina Carter or an Aaron Dworkin, or a Curtis Stewart sprinkled here and there. Of black kids scratching out scales on their matchbox violins so that someday they might play the impossible Beethoven Sonata No. 9 in A major's Opus 47, also known as the Bridgetower. I think the takeaways for today is invest, create, and build, and never do a lecture recital and a full recital on the same day. Expand our consciousness into a new incarnative we. Let us move away from labels and cultivate and challenge an inclusive and equitable environment within our programming and our lives. Let us be resilient, just like John Friedrich Bridgetower and Charlotte Papindiak, in which intentional gender-race relationships will produce new and stronger communities. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that riveting and just wonderful performance and talk.
Thank you.
We do have some time for some questions for Nicole. So are there any questions from the room?
Yes.
Oh, hold on a second. Let me just get the microphone to you so that the YouTube people can hear you.
I think we're often confronted with the idea of assimilating different cultures. So I was just wondering what you would say to those who believe that they identify very much with their labels and would feel reluctant to, say, give them away.
Reluctant to?
I suppose as you say, to move away from labels and cultivate an inclusive and equitable environment.
I think that's an excellent question, and it's a very personal question, answer to that, yes. Everybody's journey is so different, and that's what I try to be very conscious of with my own students, is that I may have, let's just say, I have 12 students that, by a governmental standpoint, identify as Latino, but not all of them had the same experience, obviously, right, in their lives. They didn't live in the same state, they didn't live in the same country, they don't have the same parents, they didn't have the same schooling necessarily, right? And so they didn't have the same access and exposure. I mean, for my own self to be in an environment that was actually predominantly white and actually see young black kids playing the instrument is completely unusual in my country, right? So that was a unique experience to empower me that my parents chose. And so I think that the best thing, the general answer to your question is to find those groups. I think that's number 2. Find your mentoring circles. Find those people that are doing things that you enjoy, that you feel passionate about, that you feel drawn to, and find and cultivate that as much as possible. It may have nothing to do with what you look like, you know, it's just something that you're connected with and that you feel led to do. And then you'll find your group from there. I mean, that Professor Juilliard, I shouldn't have said Juilliard, but anyway, it wasn't Juilliard. That professor, no, it wasn't. Just our secret, right? He led me into it by just saying that to me. He led me closer to my identity, right? He taught me where to go. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have continued my search. So each person kind of gives you that opportunity to seek more within yourself, whether it is a challenge or a nurturing of sorts. So I would say, just from the standpoint of that question, you have to look at the person that's in front of you first and ask all the questions. But as a general rule, I just say, find that thing that you love and chase it down the road till you run out of breath. You know, is generally where I go with that.
Other questions? Oh, yeah, Ben.
So, hey Nicole, sorry, although I'm just the videographer over here, but also I study composition and conducting at the conservatorium at the moment. Yeah. And I guess I've got a question which is, we as young emerging, artists coming into this world, we have a lot of challenges, and also some of them just kind of, for you to be in the music industry is a massive challenge to overcome. And that can be there's so many barriers, there's so many pressure that's being put on. And I love how you talked about mentorship and finding people around you that that support what you're doing. But at the same time, how are you able to find them? Especially as a young, emerging artist where there isn't, them at your front door. Or you can't just cold call them anymore. They'll likely go to an assistant, which would leave you on red. So,
right. Yeah. That's a great question, and definitely one that I think all of us that care as mentors and teachers struggle with daily as musicians. And I think the one thing to do for yourself is to, and I can only speak from, I'm sorry, but I can only speak from a United States point of view, but find the venues, just go to the venues that have the people in it that you suspect are there. And that's one thing. So going to many, this is the simplest answer is to go to concerts, go to book readings of music, whatever music-oriented lecture or things. I'll tell you the truth, I probably could have standed to practice more. In Juilliard, I said Juilliard again, oops. I actually spent more time, I spent more time going to Karen Tuttle lesson or a David Diamond masterclass or the Juilliard String Quartet's open rehearsal, or or talking to somebody in the hallway, or even setting up office meetings with the president of the school, then in that small four-walled space. But that's generally where I learned a lot, was just kind of a public eavesdropping, if you will. I got a lot of permission to go to everybody's lessons and everybody's classes. So that's one way, right? And then outside of your school, going as well to anything that supports the things that you're interested in. I think just out and out asking somebody, can I meet with you for a coffee? Can I buy you a coffee? And coffee's really good in Australia, so that's a plus, So going there and just say, can I sit with you and ask you a bunch of questions? Again, all the teachers that I've met here are willing to do that. You have that passion to help you, right? And the second part of that, or is this the third, is build something. Right? So I think I kind of mentioned that in number 3, but that doesn't just go to as a professional. You can find and again, I'm sorry, I'm speaking from a limited geographic here, but find a library where you can start a series. Find a school that's allowing you to build a camp. Just say you want to come every Thursday and speak about composition to the fourth graders, or these actually build networks, right? It doesn't seem like it, but it does. And I will tell you that my first performance at Carnegie Hall came from a political science teacher. I took a elective class in undergrad, and she happened to know a board member at Carnegie Hall. And so that next summer, I was playing in a small orchestra, a college-level group at Carnegie Hall. So you just never know where that reach is, right? And it was just me being interested in something she said in class, and I went and talked to her more about it. So always jump on those opportunities. Something interests you, go in that direction. Be curious constantly and act on your curiosity, and then build something, yeah. Find a group of people. For me, composers are my best friends. I see a composer and I'm like, can I buy you lunch? And it's like, okay. And then, can you write me a piece? No. Right. So, but yeah, make a lot of, you are in your business, you want to make a lot of performers friends, right? Performance major friends. So kind of cultivate that as well. I'm not saying, in an inauthentic way, in a very organic way, but be as heavy-handed, I guess, as you can to kind of cultivate your peer level of network as well as those that are your professors. These are the people that you'll be working with, right, in the next generation. And so you want to make sure that you're building that network. Once you graduate, you actually have a group of people that you've worked on being close with while you're in college. So I hope that answered your question a little bit, if there's a nugget in there for you. Yeah.
We probably have time for one more question before we let Nicole off the hook. I'll just bring the mic back.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture and performance. I really like your three verbs here: invest, create, and build. And I'd like to drill down to who's doing the investing, who's doing the creating, and who's doing the building. Now, I think I can answer create easily. It's the artists who are doing the creating. And so Beethoven's writing a sonata, for example. But if we look at who's doing the investing and who's doing the building, they're different people sometimes. So the building might be Schikaneder and to Mozart. So he's building the theatre and realising Mozart's creation. And in investing, you could look to when there was a transition from the aristocratic funding of Haydn and Mozart towards the entrepreneurial model of Handel and impresarios. So it seems to me there's an ecosystem going on here, and if you want more and better artistic creations, you have to improve all three components in that ecosystem. Now, turning to your experience of pushing forward with this, where do you see leverage, and how do you see making this process bigger and better and of higher quality where we are now?
Well, that's a question for the next millennium, for sure. I think it's kind of an old adage, I suppose, but it is so important, as you mentioned and reiterated, that we all have to be part of all three of those things, right? We all have to literally invest, right? I mean, we as students, I mean, this young man is asking about his career. He wants to be able to eat soup when he leaves school, right? He wants that, right? So investing does not just mean giving you advice. It means, how can I monetize the things that you're doing? How can I help you monetize the thing that you're doing, right? And I hope you feel that I'm passionate about music, but I also understand that we're in this to actually live and have fruitful lives, right? So that we can continue to be fruitful. And so I think that in some ways we all need to find our way to be very involved in the business aspect of music. I mean, it's a very United States version. I'm not sure, I can't speak to, again, the governmental politics here, but there is kind of a hierarchy that happens in the United States. And I think if the artists actually had more access and more empowerment in that, and engagement in the building of things. Actually, we're watching Performing Arts is a society that I mentioned before is a great example of that, where the CEO is a composer, right? And so she understands what it is to sit for hours like this gentleman and just write and then hope that it gets finished on time, and then you submit, and then then perhaps you can move on to the next project. Then understands also that local musicians need to be used. Like there's so many organizations moving outside, and San Antonio, sadly, is one of them, where there's organizations that are hiring outside instead of locally, right? So we all have to invest in that way, invest in the art and this talent that is right in front of us as well, as I speak from Texas, right? And so I think the most important component for change, to impact change, I think there's so many ways to answer that, is for all of us to be part into literal investment of the field as well. Because we're all very great at creating, and from that things are built. But the investment, the literal investment of how do you actually make this organization better so that it moves forward fiscally in the next years and things like that, has leverage, as you put it. I guess that's where I'm going to go with that for now.
Thanks, Nicole. Well, we find ourselves at the end of an extraordinary day and the end of a really extraordinary keynote, and I think it's time that we have a bit of a party. So we're going to go out to the atrium and get stuck into it. But it really has been wonderful, Nicole, having you here at the symposium and seeing your work presented on stage tonight. It really has just blown me away, and I can feel the energy in the room. And we can have more conversations with Nicole out front, but please join me in giving her a really warm thanks for such a fantastic presentation.